Well, here we are after the movies, Jason.
Yeah, I know.
We just got to see some clips from Back to the Future.
We went back to the
So
future. Heidi.
fun. Back to the 80s. And so if
That was
you
so
weren't
good.
here, we had some fun outfits in church today. You can't really see. I have like bright pink socks on.
We had a lot of
and-
denim on denim.
Yes, denim and peg jeans and
Yes.
some bright colors. Thankfully, I had something to come up with because I'm really not an 80s kind of person, I don't think. However, I did agree with you. The 80s had some of the greatest music,
the music of the 80s.
ever. And I don't really get into hair and makeup a whole lot like the 80s did. My sister is really good at that,
You
but
can
I
say
kind of miss
bouffant,
that.
perhaps,
Yeah.
for 80s hair. And Sony Walkmans.
Yes, yes, and skateboard. Jason brought his skateboard
did.
today, and he wanted to ride it onto the stage. I nixed that idea.
Because the opening scene of Back to the Future
we know,
has Marty
yes.
riding on a skateboard hanging on the back of a truck. And I
Yes.
thought, what better way to introduce the message than to ride myself onto...
Michael J. Fox probably did that often, though. And so because you have not
probably
ridden
a
a
stunt
skateboard
double.
in decades, I don't really have time in my life for you to be injured. So anyway, we just
But
showed
it's a
the
great
movie clips.
skateboard. It's a Santa Cruz
It is.
Jeff Kendall vintage
Yes,
80s street board in almost mint condition. It is fantastic.
Yeah.
So
But it was a great service here today. We had lots of decisions in the
Yeah.
second service, and so
Wonderful.
we're excited to kind of talk about some of the key points and scriptures from the message today.
yeah, and we've been doing the at the movie series, obviously taking essentially modern day parables, pulling truth. Not saying that the movie is filled with all kinds of truth, but
Right.
pulling out truth, biblical concepts that help us understand God and relate to Him better. And so, obviously, in this case, we have the main character, Marty McFly, who is young, a little bit rebellious, a little cheeky,
A little bit.
and wants to be a rock and roll superstar. He's great friends with Dr. Emmett Brown, who is a
Kind of crazy.
a kind of a
Scientist.
crazy scientist, both wanting to make their mark on life, and right now things, not really measuring up all the way, at the beginning of the movie.
Yeah, and so one of the first scriptures we started with was Proverbs chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. And it says, "He holds success in store for the upright. He is a shield to those whose walk is blameless, for he guards the course of the just and protects the way of his faithful ones." And I think that's such a great reminder when we think about really making a mark in history and not just mimicking history. We watched the scene of the principal talking to a young McFly, saying, "You're just like your dad, you're a slackard," and all the rest. And as people, there's that inner desire for each of us
Absolutely.
to be significant, to do something that counts with our life. And really, when you think about your future, the best way is to shape it with Jesus. And we looked at a quote by Dr. Phil that said, "The greatest predictor of future behavior is past behavior."
Yeah.
And while that's true, it doesn't take into account the Jesus factor for all of us, that he can indeed make something new, and we don't have to let our past dictate what our future looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. And Marty, at the close of that first clip that we use, says, well, history's going to change. And the reality is, as we know, we can't go back and change history. And a lot of times people mimic their history. They keep on making the same mistakes, doing the same things, which is what Dr. Phil's talking about. But what we can do is actually make a new history. We can make history, or we can write a new history, rather than just mimicking what the past has been. And I think there is that call. There's an echo in every heart that I want my life to matter. I want it to be meaningful. I want it to make a difference.
Yeah, and also not letting our mindset be shaped by regret, of not looking at choices from our past and saying that dictates or limits what my future looks like. There's a scene that we looked at where Marty's mom looks back at the moment when she knew she was going to spend the rest of her life with his father. And it's a moment across the dinner table that looks like she's questioning things a bit. But in all of our lives, we can look back at decisions that were made
Absolutely.
that shaped our future. And I was even talking with someone here today where a circumstance in their family, it's kind of at a fork in the road, where you can see one choice will take this person on one path, and a different choice can lead the trajectory to an entirely different future. And not letting regret or decisions from the past really shape the outcome of what's to come.
Yeah, that's so good. We have to remember that wise, I think we said this, Proverbs 2:11, that wise choices watch over you, understanding will keep you safe, and it is understanding that even though we may have some regret, I think we all do, we
Yeah.
can kind of look at our life and go, oh, if I could do a redo on that one, maybe I would. But in the midst of that it's understanding that though those mistakes could be there, that God can actually redeem those things in our life as well. So even with the things that we would view as, maybe this was a tremendous mistake, a regret, if you would, God can redeem, God can,
Amen.
when we allow him, invite him into the equation, can really take those things that we see as loss and make it to a greater gain.
Yeah, and really owning the thought. One of the takeaways from today, the big takeaways, was that my choices today
Yes.
are shaping what my tomorrow looks like.
Yep.
And sometimes we think about the future on such a grandiose scale that we don't bring it back to just daily
Yeah.
choices. And
So
it's not only determining your own future, but can be the future of generations
Yep.
to come, of your family's impact. And again, just owning what I do every day is shaping who I will become, the people that I'm with, the voices speaking into my life. That was another key thought. We looked at Biff, who is the most hateable
Biff.
character
So
in Back to the
horrible, isn't
Future.
he?
He
Oh
is
my
just a
gosh.
jerk. But we said
Yeah.
that voice can be like the enemy, who's constantly ridiculing or shaming or making us feel less than, and really paying attention to what voice am I listening to and what voice is speaking into me when it comes to my future.
Absolutely. And we talked a little bit about, there's a scene where Dr. Brown and Marty meet in a parking lot so they can do the time, the first time
Yep.
the
And
time
the
machine comes in.
DeLorean.
And it's a DeLorean.
Yeah.
And Marty's like, you chose a DeLorean to make a time machine? And it's interesting because sometimes God uses the most unique things,
Yes.
people, circumstances, to take us to the place where he wants us to go. And in this case, it was a DeLorean. In our lives, it can be a myriad of other things. And in this point, we talked a little bit about God didn't create the chasm between us and him, but he did create a way to rectify that situation
Yeah.
where, sin has crept in because of what man chose. God then responded by sending Jesus to come back and redeem. And so we had some great passages with that. If you want to.
We did, yeah. So 2 Corinthians chapter 5 says, and all of this is a gift from God who brought us back to himself through Christ. And then later in verse 21, for God made Christ, who never sinned, to be the offering for our sin, so that we could be made right with God through Christ. And then Romans 8:28, which is perhaps more familiar, we are confident that God is able to orchestrate everything.
Yes.
Boy, that's a big word. It's an
is.
inclusive word.
It is.
Orchestrate everything to work towards something good and beautiful when we love him and accept his invitation to live according to his plan. And I love the wording of that verse because it's not just okay, it's good and it's beautiful.
Yeah.
And sometimes we look at pieces from our past and say, God, I don't know how you could ever turn that around into something good. And there's a huge distinction that God did not intend that, but God allowed it in his sovereignty. And God isn't saying that what happened was good, but he can work good in all things. And that's the part of our stories of trusting God, that he can redeem the parts that you wish hadn't happened. He can redeem the regrets and make something not just okay, he can make something beautiful because he uses our stories for others. That's the redemptive part of Christ that we can never forget.
Yeah. And he's always about redeeming. God is always about restoring. God is always about taking what has been broken and making it right. And it is such a beautiful thing. I think when you lay your head down at night and you lay your head on the pillow, and that thing that comes up as the greatest disappointment, hurt, loss, regret of your life, and you think, God, there's no way on earth that you could use that. And I promise you that when we invite him into the equation, he will not only redeem that hurt, that regret, he can heal, he will restore, and he will use that in a powerful way, and for not just for your life to be whole and complete, but for the lives of others. Because again, part of the message of one of the great points of this entire message in the movie is that you are not living life on a vacuum. You're not living life in
Right.
an island. Every decision you make has a ripple and an impact on the lives of other people, including your choice to say, God, I want you to heal me, and I want you to use this thing that the enemy would use for evil, but you can redeem and use for your glory. That's so powerful for the lives of people.
It is. And, the enemy is a master of shame.
Yes.
We saw it depicted even in the movie in the character of George, who has somehow resigned himself to what Biff has said about him. He's lost his self-esteem, and he just hangs his head in shame. We read this verse from Proverbs chapter 4, 23 through 25. Be careful how you think. Your life is shaped by your thoughts. Never say anything that isn't true. Have nothing to do with lies and misleading words. Look straight ahead with honest confidence. Don't hang your head in shame. And I think that's the word of the Lord for people today, that you don't have to hang your head in shame. You can actually move forward in confidence, not just trusting that he has your future, but that he can redeem your past.
Yeah, that's so powerful. I like this thought, Heidi, Proverbs 4, 20 and 22, because you might say, well, Jason, I'm just like George. I find myself believing the lie that somebody else has superimposed on my life. I've listened to that voice so much. It's when the insult becomes the identity. And that's what the enemy wants to take. He wants to keep at you so often that you start hearing something, you believe it, though it's not true, of how God created you. And you get to that place where it's no longer an insult. It's no longer it's now my identity.
Yeah.
And so how do I reverse that? Proverbs 4, 20 and 22 says this, listen carefully, my dear children, to everything that I teach you, and pay attention to all that I have to say. This is it. For fill your thoughts with my words until they penetrate deep into your spirit. Then as you unwrap my words, they will impart true life and radiant health in the very core of your being. Boy, it's powerful.
It is huge. And then we closed out with this thought of, it's actually a quote from Dr. Emmett Brown, the crazy scientist. But he says to Marty, anything you do could have serious repercussions on future events. And sometimes I guess the extreme of that for believers could sometimes be paralyzing, to say, oh my gosh, I don't want to make any decisions that could totally wreck my future or settle for less than what God has. But there's also a freedom that can be found in releasing and trusting, like, God, in the same way that you've been faithful in my past, you are already in my present, and you have great things in store for me.
Yeah, and Heidi, you tell a story of a conversation you had, I think, when you were in college, perhaps, or high school, and just about the will of God and making the right decision. You want to kind of talk?
Yeah.
Tell
So
that story?
I was in this mode of needing to choose my college, and I was so afraid that I would choose the wrong college because I felt
the ripple's
like
real,
the
right?
ripple is real. And I thought, oh my gosh, if I don't go to the right college, I'm not going to find the one that God has for me. And I was really paralyzed with fear of not wanting to mess up or settle. And I was talking to a very insightful youth leader, and we were looking at a snowy field in Michigan, actually. And he said, Heidi, you're picturing the will of God like a set of footprints in this field that's already marked out, that if you miss one step, you're never going to make it to the barn. And he said, instead, God would say to you, this is my field, walk in it. And for me, I just remember those words my whole life, but it was a lifting of the heaviness of that and saying, I thought about that first passage we read, with wise choices, with living according to God's plan and submitting my life to his lordship, living in that field, in those boundaries, I could trust him with my future and not be afraid and not walk in fear of what the future held, but really trusting God that when we follow his plans, that they'd come to pass in his timing.
Absolutely. And you may say, well, Jason and Heidi, I can't go back and change. I don't have a DeLorean. I wish I did have a DeLorean. That would be pretty sweet.
Nice.
And be able to go back and change things. We can't do that. What we can do is choose today and invite God in the equation and say, God, I want to make a new history.
Yeah.
I want to make history. I want to write a new story, and invite him into the process of doing that for our lives where, again, he can redeem, he can heal, he can take us into the future that he's called to. It's a future that is wide open. It's wide open spaces. It's not this I got to get every little thing
Right.
right or I'm going to blow it up. God has an amazing way of doing the spiritual navigation system of rerouting us
Yeah.
when we make a choice and then getting us back on track.
Yep. So, church, we just encourage you today with the thoughts from Back to the Future that God has intended for you, not just to mimic history, but you
That's
are
right.
to make history, that He can redeem the regrets of your past. He has a great future in store for you. It comes down to daily choices,
Yep.
and we can trust Him with it. So, we love you. We hope that you have a great week.
And remember, one choice can make a difference. God bless you guys. Have a fantastic